Okay, well, this should be a very interesting discussion. My name's Chris Kanar. I've got a bell, which is very adjudicator-ish, I think. The topic for the broad discussion is Fractured Nation, Conversations about Australia's Complex Past and Contested Present. We're very lucky to have our distinguished panellists. We've already heard from David Heaton. I might just introduce Professor Marilyn Lake. Okay, now Professor Lake is Professor in History and the ARC Professorial Fellow at the University of Melbourne, where she is researching the international history of Australian democracy and convening a new lecture seminar series called Australia in the World. She's published 14 books, an amazing achievement. Her next book is called Radical Yearning and explores the close ties between Australian radical liberals and their American counterparts from 1880 until World War I. Professor Lake is a Fellow of the Academies of Humanities and Social Sciences and President of the Australian Historical Association. So welcome, Professor Lake, and thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much to Hilary and the organisers for inviting me to speak here. It's a great pleasure, and Dave's lecture introduced perfectly my own themes. I was asked to speak for 20 minutes on the theme of Fractured Nation, and to do so in a way that provoked robust debate about the past, present and future. So I have that in mind when I wrote out my remarks, and I'll keep pretty much to my script in order to try and keep to time. But Dave's lecture, it couldn't have been a sort of more perfect introduction really to my take on this. So, this will sort of logically follow. 1913, Canberra is born as our national capital on the very eve of the destruction of the nation, or at least of the national spirit, the nation's élan. And Dave conjured up really well, I think, that sense of élan in those first years. Its joie de vivre, its high reputation in the world, never glad morning again. For the very next year, in 1914, the new Commonwealth of Australia would become ensnared in an imperial war many thousands of miles away in the old world of Europe, as the Austro-Hungarian, British, German, Ottoman and Russian empires, together with the Republic of France, became entangled in a cataclysm that would cost millions of lives. There was, in fact, vociferous opposition to Australia's participation in this war, out of that idealism about which Dave spoke. But it largely went unheeded, but not completely unheeded, because clearly the opposition to the war deepened as the years dragged on, and it informed the successful and bitter campaigns against conscription in 1916 and 1917. In World War I, we could say Australia lost its way. World War I fractured the nation's soul. I want to make my argument with reference to the experience of a largely forgotten Australian, but one of Australia's unsung national heroes, who is yet, I think, uncommemorated in the national capital. I asked Dave about this, and he reminded me that there is indeed, in a very Canberra way, in a sense, a suburb named after Henry Bourne Higgins, President of the Commonwealth Court of Conciliation and Arbitration, whose innovative jurisprudence in support of the idea of a living wage, shaped by an intense commitment to social justice and the public good, won him renown around the world. And it led to an invitation to visit the United States in early 1914, before the outbreak of World War I. That violent upheaval that would plunge his world, and that of Australia more generally, into the depths of despond. It would seem appropriate then, I think, to remember him now as we commemorate the centenary of the national capital and prepare to deal with the veritable tidal wave, or perhaps juggernaut is the better metaphor, of military commemoration, funded already by $115 million from the government, even as our universities and historians employed in them face ongoing funding cuts, and a new round just announced the other day. Already over last weekend, The Age newspaper was already full of military history, including a lament that, quote, "the most significant commemorative event in our history has not been well planned." but who determines what are the most significant events in our history to be commemorated. In this year, 2013, I think we should commemorate those who fought for Australia's distinctive civic and political ideals. In the years of peacetime, the halcyon days, the halcyon years before World War I, and we might seek to carry those forward. I'm currently writing a book, as was mentioned, called Radical Yearning, about Higgins, together with a larger group of radical liberals, largely Melbourne-based, at the forefront of global democratic reform, who travelled to the New World Republic of the United States from the late 19th century into the 20th century. And again, from Dave's talk, you get a sense of this toing and froing, this backward and forward visiting between the United States and Australia, these two New World countries. They were propelled to do these trips by a need to free themselves from the entrenched social and political hierarchies and class inequalities of the old world, to forge connections with the Great Republic, as they called it, across the Pacific. It's a study that's given me insight into Australia's high reputation in the world as a distinctive, pioneering, brave, indeed bold democracy, and the friendships and political identifications of our radical liberal leaders. My research focuses on a group of 8, 4 men and 4 women. Fittingly, as in the Griffins, Charles Pearson, Andrew Inglis Clark, Alfred Deakin and H.B. Higgins, and Catherine Spence, Vida Goldstein, Alice Henry and Miles Franklin. In this centenary year of the founding of our national capital, it's important, I think, to do, just as Dave did, to recall the democratic idealism of these founding fathers and mothers in our halcyon days, architects of Australia's famous state experiments, who mostly hailed from and worked in our first national capital, Melbourne, but whose dreams were cruelly dashed by Australia's ensnarement in the European war many thousands of miles away, that saw, amongst other things, the British Empire declare war on the Ottoman Empire. The British invasion of the Ottoman Empire laid the basis for the subsequent conflict and crisis that marked the history of the Middle East ever since, fully documented in David Fromkin's history called A Peace to End All Peace, the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the modern Middle East, which I suggest should be compulsory reading for any of those interested in Australia's complicity in these events, whose destructive consequences we live with still. At the beginning of World War I, British Prime Minister Asquith had written, quote, "Few things would give me greater pleasure than to see the Turkish Empire finally disappear from Europe and Constantinople become Russian, which I think is its proper destiny," he said, or if that is impossible, neutralised. And yet, British and French forces, including a range of colonials, Indians, New Zealanders, Australians, invaded the Ottoman Empire to enable Tsarist Russia, occupying Constantinople, which is hardly a beacon of democracy and freedom, to occupy Constantinople. And this event is now translated, as we know, by the agencies of our government, the educators at DVA, and thus our school children through them and the Prime Minister, as Australians for fighting for freedom. I mean, this is a sort of curious translation. I remind you of this larger history then, this larger history of the British invading the Ottoman Empire, both because it's really interesting, I think, for historians anyway, and to explain why the war and its aftermath occasioned such disillusionment and such despair among contemporaries, including Higgins. One of the Australian boys who enlisted and died in the Middle East on 23rd of December 1916, 2 days before Christmas, was Higgins's only son, Mervyn, a student before he enlisted at the University of Oxford. His loss caused unrelieved suffering for Higgins and his wife, Mary Alice, as such suffering was caused, of course, across the nation and across the world. And it converted Higgins, already sceptical about Australia's involvement in the war, into a convinced internationalist, the new wave of idealism. He'd been a staunch and courageous opponent of Australia's participation in the Boer War, or the South African War, fearing that this would set a terrible precedent for the new Commonwealth of Australia, for future wars whose purposes, goals and strategies would always be determined by others. In 1902, in the shadow of the Boer War, he wrote an essay called Australian Ideals, in which he inquired about how the new Commonwealth could best secure the public interest as opposed to the private interest. And the whole symbolism of the name Commonwealth was about securing that public common interest. And he feared and he wondered whether we might become a militaristic nation. This is 1902. Militarism he equated with unquestioning obedience, authoritarianism, hierarchy, and vainglory. Australians had to choose, he wrote, between the opposing standards of militarism and social reform. And in the next few years, in the glory days of nation building before World War I, Higgins would himself be at the forefront in shaping what was recognised internationally on the world stage as a pioneering social democracy. Then, at the end of 1916, his son was killed. Now, no hope more, he wrote in a poem about the boy's death. The dreaded thing has come. Higgins had been condemned, he wrote, to hard labour for the rest of his life. He wrote of his grief to his American friend, the eminent Harvard professor of law, Felix Frankfurter, and in a gesture of painful intimacy sent him a photo of his son. "It's a fancy of mine which you will forgive," he wrote, "a desire that our American friends should see what our boy was like, and I feel secure when I commit a thing so sacred to you." Devastated by grief, he sought solace in the prospect of a new internationalism, an end to war. "Vengeance is a fruitless thing," he wrote to Frankfurter. "I feel that the best vengeance my dead boy could hope for would be an integrated world, an organised humanity. No nationalist flag waving or eulogies to the Anzac spirit for him. Rather, Higgins became a keen student of the anti-nationalist writings of Indian Nobel Prize winner Rabindranath Tagore, who, by the way, was the first Asian writer ever to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and this happened also in 1913. And Higgins accepted appointment in Melbourne as president of the local branch of the World Disarmament Movement. Higgins had first met Felix Frankfurter, who'd be later appointed to the Supreme Court, when he visited Boston at the invitation of a key progressive, Robert Valentine, who introduced Higgins to a network of social reformers and labour activists, public-spirited men and women, as he fondly remembered, all keen to meet him. The subject that brought them together in these months before the outbreak of World War I was Australia's world historic invention of a legislated minimum wage, which happened with the Victorian Factory Act in 1896, the meaning of which was elaborated by Higgins himself in his famous Harvester judgment of 1907 as a living wage designed to meet the capacious needs of human beings, that is, workers treated as human beings in a civilised society. The novelty of this innovation can be understood from the attack by a conservative American opponent, Samuel Crowther, in Collier's magazine. Crowther wrote, "The American workman, having enjoyed high wages during the war, now wants a living wage," and he has that in quote marks to signal that he's borrowing the phrase from elsewhere, "not only defined by law, but granted by law." The use of quote marks was significant, as became clear when he referred to the Australian origins of this idea. In Australia, he said with some amazement, the living wage is based not on the value of a man's work, but on his requirements as a man in a civilised society. The results, he said, were disastrous. Wages very high, prices very high, and taxation ruinous. Australian experience was central to the American and British debate that swirled around the minimum wage in these years. The significance of this social reform can only be understood, I think, in the context of the long 19th century and the historic memory of slavery, of contract labour, of labour migration that saw millions of Chinese and Indians relocated through the British Empire, of coolie labour, of the trade in Pacific Islanders and wage slavery that underpinned the older societies of the world and underpinned imperial colonies based on caste and class distinctions. Anti-slavery discourses that characterised women as white slaves and workers as wage slaves perpetuated the public memory of slavery that underpinned so much feminist and labour activism well into the 20th century. Progressive American commentators hailed Higgins' theorisation of the living wage for its avowed humanism, to demand that a worker be recognised first and foremost and always as a human being, not a commodity to be bought and sold at the lowest price. And many international observers visited Australia during these halcyon years, many international observers from France and Germany and Britain and the United States, to investigate how the new civilisation worked. One of the most influential was a professor in sociology and economics at Ohio State University, M.B. Hammond, who took a year's sabbatical leave in 1911 to come and see how the Australian system worked. He was mightily impressed, and he pointed out that he had to come to Australia and New Zealand because the old countries and England had done nothing yet along these lines. So he came to Australia and he researched widely and interviewed widely, and he wrote many subsequent articles in the United States. In one article in the prestigious journal, the American Economic Review in 1913, again, Hammond emphasised the explicitly humanist values that underpinned Higgins's judgments, to quote, a growing sense of the value of human life, and concluded with a glowing tribute to his seminal role as a theorist of Australia's world historic experiment in social democracy. Hammond wrote, "He has certainly expressed at greater length and with greater clearness than has anyone else the ideals which have animated the Australian people and the Australian lawmakers in placing on the statute books the body of social legislation which has drawn the eyes of all the world to Australasia and which marks the most notable experiment yet made in social democracy." So here we have the most notable experiment yet made in social democracy. It was the humanist dimension of Higgins's living wage that impressed these reformers, commentators, journalists, and a range of US judges such as Louis Brandeis, Leonard Hand, Roscoe Pound, who would be Dean at Harvard, and Frankfurter. Now, Alice Henry, the Australian editor of the American National Women's Trade Union League Journal, explained to her readers in an editorial, again in 1913, the significance of this new idea of the living wage. She wrote, "It means more than humanity has ever asked for before. It is a noble, a dignified demand, something at least worthy of humanity, for it means more than life. It means the right at last for all to be human, to be their best selves, to develop who knows what capacities, what unguessed of powers. What may we not expect of one another and of humanity once that decent plane of existence is guaranteed for all?" Now, Alice Henry had herself arrived in the United States in 1906, had gone to England on the way, but found England really depressing because she said they didn't show any interest in our social experiments. And indeed, they were condescending and mocking and criticising. So she fled from England across the Atlantic to the United States. And when she landed in New York, she found a whole group of friends there to welcome her, and they took her in. She wrote in her memoir, "I was taken in at once and made welcome, a favoured visitor from faraway Australia. It was an introduction to the social workers' world at its best and highest, with close connections to the labour movement." 5 minutes, thanks. Alice Henry was delighted with what she called the sisterly interest, which I think is an interesting conception of relations between Australia and the United States on the part of Americans in her new country. She wrote, "Australia was a word to rouse interest in all that circle, and I arrived at a moment when Australia was beginning some of her most notable experiments in social legislation." She was soon taken up to speak to women's clubs and suffrage societies about the workings of womanhood suffrage in Australia. How did it work? What had been achieved? What was its effect? Because Australia had also earned a global reputation as an advanced democracy when Australian women became the first in the world to win full political rights. They were, as one American admirer put it, an object lesson whose achievement would help what they called the cause of human liberty throughout the earth. US President Theodore Roosevelt also declared it an object lesson and invited Vida Goldstein, also in the United States in 1902, to meet him. Roosevelt would later, when Higgins was there, go out of his way to seek Higgins out in his Washington hotel. Roosevelt said all his progressive friends said he must go and meet him. And American newspapers noted that the working man and the voting woman advanced in this democracy together, because in all the elections, 1903, 1906, 1908, 1910, the Labor vote increased. Women could vote in this enfranchised decade. And until finally in 1910, the first Labor government with majorities comes into government. And that government extends to women what they had lobbied for, which was the maternity allowance, also extended to unmarried women, unlike what happened in the 1950s and 60s. In the years before the inauguration of the new Commonwealth of Australia then in 1901 and the outbreak of the European War, Australia rode high in its global reputation for advanced progressive legislation. I have to sort of cut some of this short, but the war basically destroyed these ideals. It fractured the nation. Australia lost its way. And not only huge divisions, class divisions, religious divisions, political divisions, gender divisions during the war, but new divisions, and particularly the division between those who enlisted and the stay-at-homes, as they were called, the shirkers, who would be sent white feathers. So one of Hughes's main targets was Higgins, and it ends up with Higgins having to resign from his cherished court. And there was a sense in which the war had broken Higgins's heart. He'd lost his son, he'd lost his court. You know, it was a completely destructive experience. So I just want to end then by contrasting, as I say, these halcyon nation-building years full of idealism between 1901 and 1913, and the significance then of 1913, and then what happened next when Australia was taken into the Imperial War. And finally, on the website, you will see that, of course, you will know this, that the war is cast as a creative achievement. It creates a national identity. It's a creative experience. And it's said to create a national identity in which various characteristics such as courage figure largely. Well, I would suggest, to finish, that critics of the Anzac excess in which we're engulfed, need all the courage we can muster. For like those who opposed conscription in World War I, as described by Higgins, critics of Anzac excess are always also accused of treason and disloyalty, just as happened in World War I itself. And history teachers, I suggest, above all, I say this to you, must show courage in defending the integrity of history against all those mythologisers who make ill-founded historical claims. They must distinguish fact from fiction, mythology from history, and place texts in context, and particularly in world context. Our nation was not born in the cataclysm of World War I. Rather, that carnage left us a fractured nation, disillusioned, disoriented, desolate, and dependent on a resurgent British Empire. And just to finish with some words from Miles Franklin, that inimitable Australian, and in her inimitable words. She wrote in 1924, she too spent about 8 years living and working in the United States, in Chicago. She wrote to her friend Margaret Dyer Robbins in 1924. She said, "It seems to me," and this exactly fits in with what Dave was saying about the 20s and the desolate 20s. She said, "It seems to me that Australia, which took a wonderful lurch ahead in all progressive laws and women's advancement about 20 years ago, has stagnated ever since. At present," she said, "it is more unintelligently conservative and conventional than England. And I am sad to see the kangaroo and his fellow marsupials and all the glories of our forests disappearing to make room for a mediocre repetition of Europe." As we face the militarist onslaught over the next 5 years, I wish you all then bon courage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Lake, for a very interesting and wide-ranging and stimulating presentation. We're going to hold questions, if you don't mind, and move to our next speaker, another very distinguished visitor. Professor Anne McGrath is the Professor of History at Professor of History and Director of the Australian Centre for Indigenous History at the Australian National University. Her interests are gender, colonialism, film and the history of Indigenous relations in Australia and North America. Her work has included coordinating the history project of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, various Northern Territory land claims, and Professor McGrath was accepted as a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and was awarded an Order of Australia Medal for services to history, especially Indigenous history. So thank you very much for joining us today, Professor McGrath.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Chair, for your kind introduction. Well, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal Ngambri people. I believe you had a welcome from them yesterday morning. My talk is a little different from David and Marilyn's, as I've been asked to be a provocateur, and normally I'd be heartily agreeing with my learned colleagues, but I'm going to try to purposely disagree with them so we can have a good debate. But I'd also like to say it's great to speak to history teachers because we're always fascinated as historians who write and research and also teach university students what the history teachers might make of us. But then to look at our own, my own history, my favourite history teacher was incredibly inspiring, and she was actually sacked from my school, All Hallows, for recommending radical books to us. And they were The Female Eunuch, and the other one was about radical education. What was it called? Summer something. Yes, yeah. And anyway, so this taught me in a very powerful way the radical potential of history and how you could be so radical as a history teacher you could be sacked for your beliefs. So she permanently, Miss Cochrane, her name was, became my heroine. So anyway, I would like to challenge my colleagues on a few issues before raising some other issues which partly stem from my own research too. And I know they won't be able to answer straight away, so we'll hold the discussion and debate till later. First of all, David gave us a sweeping rendition of world history in many ways, the intellectual influences that led to Canberra, and Marilyn talked about the inspiring visions for a future nation. They both talked about a bold democracy, and yet they both talked about fracture, and this seems to be a bit of a sour note in Vision Splendid, our wonderful title for the conference. However, I would think that this idea of a bold democracy was actually one that was reifying a particular type of citizen, and that citizen and the only people who were envisaged to vote really in the build-up was the white male. And so I guess I would argue that the big fracture in the history of our nation is in its very chronology and in the very idea of nation, and in this intellectual diaspora which did emphasise the US and Britain and settler coloniser nations and Europe, there was this idea that people who did not have writing did not actually have nations and did not actually have history. And I know that I was actually a co-author with Marilyn in a national history called Creating a Nation, and we tried to integrate the history of Aboriginal Australia in the history of the nation. However, we started in 1788, and so this is where I think we're still facing this big chronological problem of how do we tell the story of civilisations that managed to survive through climate change in this nation since possibly 50,000 years ago. One of the problems with the dates is the scientists keep debating them. And one of my calls to historians would be, okay, we might be over that boring debate of are we an art, are we a science, but why aren't we working more closely with scientists? Like, why aren't we having the conversations with them to understand the evidence that is in our land of these amazing civilisations. And I've been doing quite a bit of work at Lake Mungo and Willandra Lakes, and I hear that that's now in the national curriculum as an exemplar of ancient Australia. But we have an ancient which is a lot more ancient than the Scots even. And I think that Neil Oliver, his talk yesterday was very inspiring. And I did think it was very interesting the way he said Indigenous Australians are better at connecting with their ancestors and that ancient past than a lot of us, and I suppose he meant people of European background, are. And I find that very much, and I talk to Discovery Rangers quite a lot, these Indigenous rangers who take you on tours of Lake Mungo, and they talk about the past as yesterday, because I often say, how do you imagine something 50,000 years ago like that? Just, how do you imagine something 4,000 or 6,000 years ago? And they will say, well, that Lady Mungo, who's, probably 50,000 years, she lived on the earth like us as a human, modern Homo sapiens sapien with, similar kinds of skin. She breathed the same air. She's made of the same hydrogen and oxygen, or relying on that same oxygen as what we do. And if you speak to an astrophysicist, that's a bit of an eye-opener because they can't believe we're only looking at Earth's history. And they'll start to tell you the most amazing things. In fact, when I was trying to have a discussion about time with an astrophysicist, I said, we really need to understand more about how you think about time. And this woman, Lisa Cooley, who's at Mount Stromlo and was at Hawaii, she sort of said to me, well, we're the only people who can actually see the past, because we're looking at ancient galaxies as they move and as they do things several million years ago. So I guess historians are interested in bringing the past to life, bringing the past into the present. And I think for many historians it seems an insuperable obstacle to try and do that for something that happened 50,000 years ago. However, I think we do need to do it, and I think that Indigenous Australians, traditional owners, have the keys to this because they do understand time differently. They have fresh ways of looking at the past, and it often is through connection with physical evidence and a respect for their dead, and a belief that they actually shouldn't be interfered with and they should be respected. And I don't want to go into all their notions of time, but they also do. They believe that they know stories about when the stars were on the ground. So before they went up, like the Seven Sisters, which we may know as Pleiades, actually went up into the sky. So they sort of say, don't talk about deep history or ancient history with us. So there's a bit of one-upmanship going on here. So I guess the big question for history teachers and for history, it is about how you convince a young generation that history matters. And I think that both David and Marilyn have raised issues of great significance about, Marilyn's talk shows so clearly about how we forget the past. We don't remember this inspiring beginnings and the excitement of hopes for a future nation. But at the same time, we can forget other things, like we can forget we wanted to be a republic, which Marilyn mentioned. And I suppose my challenge to her would be, why blame World War I? Because I think it's the Boer War's fault that we didn't become a republic, because there was a lot of Republican sentiment in all the popular literature in the 1880s. And it seemed that the Boer War made everybody loyal to the Crown. And we as Australians still have this deep-seated, somehow, respect for the Crown. Aboriginal people also have this strong link with the Crown. And Jimmy Clements, the ubiquitous man in the photo who stood in front of Parliament House when it was opened in Canberra, who had walked with his friend John Noble all the way from Gundagai, with no shoes on and who were not allowed into the celebration because of their attire, not wearing shoes, actually ended up meeting the Duke and Duchess anyway, who later became the King and the Queen's mother, I think. Yeah, the Duke of Cornwall. I'm not very good on royal history. That's right. But Aboriginal people have always had this interest, in Queen Victoria and the Crown. Well, we may think this is odd or antiquated. Well, hello, we still actually are under a crown, and the land is called Crown land that we dispossess from them. So it's interesting to hear of, Canberra's leasehold, and also, this great idea of surveyors surveying a place. The Great Land Rush was actually an international land rush in settler coloniser countries, and we know whose sovereignty was being taken over by measuring everything up and carefully getting your leveller out and so forth. On a slightly different tangent, when I think of Vision Splendid, I think of a wonderful novel by Tom Ronan, who was a pastoral station owner in the Northern Territory. And this novel is actually about a white man working on a cattle station who's a bookkeeper called Toppingham, and he falls in love with this beautiful Aboriginal woman, and he tries to stay civilised and not go Aboriginal, so he does this by shaving his beard, which is sort of interesting. But he becomes very repressed and he goes stark raving mad because he's madly in love with this woman, but he feels he can't go to the Aboriginal way. And curiously, the author, who's a very clever man, a beautiful writer, actually called his book Vision Splendid, which I think is interesting because that is an example of a potential integration of nation and an idea and a vision for nation, perhaps a vision splendid, that we might be able to get into our history books if only we could be more creative and work out ways of doing this. Just before I ask my final questions to David and Marilyn, I just wanted to show you this site that we've developed. And so it's, I suppose the thing is, in this digital era, a lot of students just aren't reading books anymore. They won't read books, so they are quite happy to get a lot of information from the web, and they're often good quality articles. But when it comes to a book, they're more likely to be doing a Google search than reading the whole book. And history as a tradition has really relied upon this sustained reading, getting deeply into ideas, the sort of, great talks that you've heard today. So what we're trying to do in this project, which was funded by the Australian Research Council in collaboration with lots of major national institutions, I suppose I should show the logos of my partners here, and we also have some great historians working on this project too. A little bit sluggish, isn't it? But we couldn't have done this without working with all these partners. But what we've done here is developed digital histories, and I'm just wondering and hoping that some of these digital histories are ways to jump the 1788 time barrier. We've got a digital history product. This is just the beginning of it. We've got a few sites up and going, and it's called Pelican Dreaming. And this site actually is both scholarly and aiming for a popular audience in that it actually takes the person using it on a tour of a stone tool exchange in the Northern Territory. Thanks. We're using interactive mapping to actually show you where the stone tool exchange went, so that if you go on a tour, you're not only looking at the Stuart Highway and following the white explorers' routes, but you're actually seeing an exchange of stone tools in honour of the Pelican Dreaming story, which actually goes back at least 2,000 years and which is still going today. So that's one way to jump that hurdle. But we also have audio and video, and I won't have time to show you the video, but you've got, if you just look up Deepening Histories, you'll see we've got both archival, old footage and recent footage. And you'll find the first time you use it, it always takes a little bit long to buffer, but once you've used it once on your computer, it's quite quick to download. Basically, there's a huge gallery that's divided into many, many different themes, and you can look that up and you can obtain a lot more information about each theme and the whole story of the stone tool exchange. And there's a great deal more information. So anyway, we've thought it was interesting to be able to present a multivocal history, to use images, video and mapping, and to relate history to place. And we have had the idea that relating history to place was a way of deepening our insights into nation. There's others which probably won't go back there. There's a music one. There's a music downloadable product that was done in Sydney about Sydney people's relationships using very contemporary modes of music. Don't ask me how to get back to the main page here. But anyway, you can play you can play around with that yourselves and work out how to get more out of it. So I guess my own prescription to try to improve the situation with our fractured history was to work with Indigenous custodians of land in regional areas, try to work more in interdisciplinary teams, and to try to use digital mediums to break down the unifying syntheses we sometimes feel we've got to come up with one voice in history. And I think we do need new ways to tell stories as historians. We need new ways to reach young audience and the digital generation. So, to start our debate, I guess it would be interesting to hear what Marilyn thinks about that Boer War question. And also, David, in the story of surveying and taking over land, I suppose I'd like to ask you whether that was a sort of more universal global trend in asserting sovereignty that was going on, which is perhaps a deeper history of nation that we haven't taken into account. Thank you.
Well, Professor McGrath, thank you very much for, I guess, providing an alternative view from our first two speakers and I guess, returning to the theme of fragmented history. I just mentioned that thanks to the wonders of technology, this session is being streamed, and so when we do move to questions, there is the possibility that people in cyberspace will be able to send a question to Jose, and by magic, that question can be relayed. So, and the other thing is when we do get to questions, if people could please wait to get the microphone. We have a very great student volunteer, Alex, who's going to take the microphone around. I know Marilyn suggested that we go straight to questions, but I wonder if I could just give both of our first speakers a right of reply in terms of what Anne had to say.
Okay. Yes, I suggested we go straight to the audience because there's so little time left, and I'm sure a lot of you want to ask questions. And in reply to Anne's notion about the Boer War, I mean, it's absolutely important. That's absolutely right, and that's why it's really interesting that Higgins wrote his essay called Australian Ideals in the Shadow of the Boer War in 1902, because he saw, and I think it's really important as historians for us to look at what contemporaries saw, and he saw that Australia's engagement in the Boer War set the dangerous precedent that would be followed through the century. So you're completely right.
And for mine, I just merely, certainly in terms of the survey stories that applies to the national capital, we know that it's true. It was a part of the empire endeavour. It's interesting, though, that the one difference between surveyors today and surveyors 100 years ago was the high significance with which they were, the esteem with which they were held by the community, and it was seen as every bit an equal of the other design professions, and then that's changed over 100 years. But let's go to the floor.
Great, well, thank you. So, yes, we are open for questions. So would anyone like up the back, please, Alex?
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a local high school teacher. My question for the panel, I'd like each panel member to use their academic wisdom and their insight, which they've primed our pump this morning with, to answer in 2 to 3 sentences each. Yeah, that'll be a challenge. No, I'm guilty of that too. But in 2 to 3 sentences each, how do you predict, lay out how you think this nation's going to become a republic? And the second challenge is project tonight that you're having drinkies down at the George Harcourt Inn or somewhere. Yeah, try and give us the honest answer about how you think the bumpy road or the ugly road or the glorious road is going to be from our nation, where we are now, to becoming a republic, because it'd be fascinating.
No, my first sentence is that historians are not known for being great predictors of the future. And my second sentence would be that I think that we have to care about the future of our nation, and I don't know whether we have a sense of a vision of our nation anymore, which is a very depressing thought, so I better think of a third sentence that's a little bit happier. I guess it's to get a great vision and to be excited about what we can be in the future.
Yes. That's right. As Anne said, historians are quite cautious about making predictions, although one of the really influential national writers I've studied a lot, Charles Pearson, famously his whole book was a prophecy, and the prophecy was about the rise of Asia and the rise of China as the leading power, and he turned out to be spot on 100 years before the time. So maybe we can chance our arm. I think Australia will become a republic. I think it's inevitable, and I think it's logical.
Sadly, the Reverend John Dunmore Lang in 1852 said he thought it was inevitable in his lifetime. That's why. Equally sadly, I was always of the opinion in terms of my life that I would see an Australian republic in my lifetime. I'm not quite so convinced now. But my third sentence would be, I think there are 2 ways in which it may happen in the not so distant future. One, to pick up on Anne's point, that certainly the vision of nation, and I love what Marilyn was just talking about. I mean, that rediscovery of the qualities of the past that can be used. And secondly, to reconnect with Australian Republican history, that history that pretty much began in the 1820s and that was such a significant part of 19th century history all the way through to the 1890s.
My question is about the role of Anzac Day as a commemoration in society in Australia now. Do you think that Anzac itself has taken on a new significance past commemoration of those who have fought and died? And you certainly questioned the amount of money that's being spent commemorating that. And what would be a better way or a more significant way, in your opinion, of commemorating it? I suppose that's a two sort of questions. What is the significance of Anzac Day? Does it go beyond what it's originally intended to be? And if that's the case, what would you see or prefer to see as that commemoration?
Yes, thank you. It's a very, very big question, of course. The meaning attributed to Anzac Day, of course, itself changes historically. I mean, as historians, we would expect that its meaning in 1916 would be quite different than today for all sorts of reasons. I, of course, like most critics of the excess, have no problem whatsoever with commemorating those who died in service to the country. The problem for us, the two or three problems. One is the historical claims that are made. I mean, ridiculous historical claims are made in its name, you know, that Australia was born, the Australian identity, etc., when Dave and my work showed how strong a sense there was of Australia, you know, the idealism and that we could create and were creating, you know, a world-leading democracy. That all happened in peacetime. In peacetime, that was an achievement of peacetime, not of war. So I think as historians, as I said, we really have to defend the integrity of history. And thirdly, to go to the money. One reason everything's changed in the last 20 years, which we document in great detail in our book, What's Wrong with Anzac, which I wrote with Henry Reynolds and Joy DeMusi and Mark McKenna, you can document through research the huge amount of money that went into DVA from the late 1990s, quite deliberately, as DVA. Well, DVA itself is a new department, of course. There used to be the Repat Commission that, you know, looked after returned soldiers and their relatives. DVA is a new entity altogether, and there's a much larger brief, much more money to so-called commemoration. You know, you can see it all set out. So, you know, a lot of us have a lot of problems with the way that department impinges so much on the interpretation of history, of national history. And it does so at a time, as I said, when universities are being cut back all around the country. I know this as president of the AHA. The number of historians now employed in universities is about a third what it was 20 years ago. So as it were, professional historians are being cut back and unable to do a proliferation of history. So this particular kind of history is being built up and, you know, proliferating and swelling in the national capital as it happens, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think, I won't sort of go on about that, but if you read What's Wrong with Anzac, we provide some explanation.
Can I respond to that too? We actually have some money from Department of Veterans Affairs to do this really big project about Indigenous veterans. So I think it goes back to this problem of how is the national history imagined? Anzac now has this pride of place in the national history books, but it also is seen to signify all wars and involvement in wars. But then I think we'll think, what are wars about? You know, the whole symbolism is sacrifice of your life for the nation, and it's about death and loss and family grieving. And, you know, so war does touch on all these incredibly important historical, human, family issues. And so for Indigenous Australians, it's incredibly important because it's not a victim story for them, it's a story of pride and inclusion in the nation. So in ways, it's because the nation has defined Anzac and fighting in wars so important that they're saying, we want to be recognised for what we have done. And even on the apology day, the emotions running so high there on the Parliament House lawns, some people, Aboriginal people, were wearing T-shirts that said, we have a black history, and they were holding books about my uncle was a digger and my grandfather was a digger. So no, it is to do with an inclusive nationalism as well. So therefore it gets a little bit complicated.
Two things very quickly. One, it's interesting that in the late 1980s, Ken Inglis went on record, a fine Australian historian, saying that he didn't think there was any future for Anzac Day, that it was in a process of disintegration, and that was 25 years ago. And look at what's changed. And certainly Marilyn's book, and I haven't read it yet, but and I look forward to reading that. And one part of it was definitely the money. But the other thing I just throw into the mix, I can't help but be struck by the fact that that over the last 20 years, for younger Australians, one part of this is the notion of trying to identify, whether they know it or not, the sacred. And of course, there's a lot of promotion going on in that and a lot of manipulation. But nevertheless, that one part of it is that we're not talking about, the vast numbers turning up, and getting drunk at Gallipoli and, every Anzac Day. But one part of it is trying to identify the sacred in an increasingly secular Australia and secular world, which I find interesting.
Unfortunately, the speakers have done a brilliant job of sticking to time, but we are almost out of time. So I think we might have time for just one more question, please.
Hi, I got here a little bit late, so you may have already addressed this, but I was just interested on the panellists' comments about the notion of multiculturalism and its contribution to a fragmented nation.
Yeah, can I say something about that? I think multiculturalism is really, really important as a phase of the building of our democracy, because one of the things about this incredibly idealistic democracy about human worth and social justice and the public domain was that it was, of course, in 1901, as Anne pointed out, imagined in the framework of white Australia. Now, so what Democrats had to do in subsequent generations, what democratic activists had to do, was to broaden that frame, and so gradually it was broadened, and multiculturalism, the sort of advent of the idea of multiculturalism in the 1960s and 70s was incredibly important, I think, officially, in doing exactly that, if you like, in saying that this democratic project has to be inclusive of, a wide range of Australians, of all Australians, and not limited to just those who are white. So if we look at the long history of democracy, of the building of democracy in this nation, then I think multiculturalism occupies a really important place.
Just very quickly, since I've given one aspect of the National Capital story, just in case you're interested, there are DVDs. I've been doing stuff for ABC TV for the last few years, and there are DVDs that are free. They would have cost if we'd gone into ABC stores for all the rights, but they are free and they're available. And perhaps if you're interested and you gave your address or details to Hillary or one of the conference organisers, I can arrange for those to be sent. And also, there are 5 booklets upstairs on Canberra Centenary history. I wanted to plug that just so you knew they existed, but the other thing is that it's interesting with the Griffins, and I picked that up. There'll be a 6th booklet coming out very shortly. The Chief Minister will be launching that in the next few weeks that I've written, which picks up the Griffin story and the idealism. And one part of it is to talk about Canberra as a city built on ideas more than anything else. And certainly the Griffins bring to the table a very interesting, eclectic reading, which appeared to be at odds with some of the strictures of white Australia. So we even have that built into the early foundation story, and that only increased in the Griffins period from the time they came in 1914 until Walter went to India in 1935 to die in 1937. But that 20 years there is real multiculturalism and belief in that concept without calling it, using that term, of course, in the Griffins as part of the Canberra story. Very interesting part of it.